What if the greatest Viking trick was not that they could build a ship in a single day, but that they could make it look as if they had? That is the real mystery hidden inside the famous image of the Longship. The dragon prow, the striped sail, the river of oars, the sudden appearance of a fleet where there had been only shoreline, forest, and silence. To a farmer, a monk, or an enemy scout watching from a cliff, it might have felt like sorcery. One day there was no ship, then, astonishingly fast, there was a ship ready to slide into water. But the truth is more impressive than the myth. Vikings did not turn standing trees into a finished ocean-going vessel between sunrise and sunset. They did something harder. They built a culture, a craft tradition, and a labor system so efficient that the final assembly of a ship could happen with breathtaking speed because months of preparation had already been packed into every timber, every tool mark, and every practiced hand. The miracle was not haste. The miracle was mastery. And that is where this story becomes irresistible. Because if we follow the evidence left in ship burials, harbor finds, museum reconstructions, runic traces, medieval saga texts, and the Bayeux Tapestry, a different picture emerges. Written sources from the Viking Age are rare, and the Vikings left very few detailed contemporary descriptions of their own longships. What survives is scattered across rune stones, skaldic verse later written down, foreign chronicles, medieval sagas, and laws that preserve older naval practice. Yet these fragments, together with archaeology, tell us something very clear. Viking shipbuilding was not improvised. It was organized, technical, and deeply social. It belonged to a world where kings could demand fleets, harbor towns could supply ships, craftsmen could read wood like language, and a master builder could shape a hull largely by eye, with rules stored in memory rather than on paper. Here is the first dramatic truth. The one-day ship was already half built before a single plank touched the keel. Everything began in the forest, not at the shore. The boat builder's first job was not carving, it was choosing. Modern museum boat builders working from Viking evidence stress the same point. If the wrong tree was chosen, the whole ship could be compromised. Viking builders did not want just any oak. They wanted trees whose fibers would serve the purpose of the ship. Straight oak, free of knots, could become planks. Naturally curved branches and crooked timbers from the crown could become frames. Even the keel demanded a trunk with the right length, strength, and grain. In other words, the Viking ship was not forced onto wood. It was discovered inside the tree. The builder looked at a forest and did not merely see lumber. He saw stems, strakes, knees, and ribs waiting to be released. That matters because Viking ships were not basically carved out of sawn boards in the modern sense. They were cleaved. Oak was split with wedges along the grain and the tree's own radial lines. This was slower, tougher, and far more intelligent than simply sawing through the wood. A sawn board cuts across fibers and weakens them. A cleaved plank follows them. That meant the finished piece could be thinner, lighter, and still astonishingly strong. It also meant that the builder was working with the natural logic of the tree instead of fighting it. Modern reconstructions of Viking ships still emphasize this because it is one of the secrets that made longships both light and resilient. They could flex in a seaway without breaking like brittle shells. And suddenly the myth starts to change shape. The fast part was not magical speed with the axe. The fast part was that the right log, once chosen and split correctly, had already done much of the design work for you. Then came the spine. The keel was shaped first, usually from oak, cut down gradually with the axe until the long backbone of the vessel emerged. The stems at bow and stern were fashioned separately, also mostly with axes and chisels, then scarfed onto the keel with rivets and caulking between the joining faces. At this stage, the ship was still nothing like the iconic vessel in our imagination. It was more like a promise laid on supports, a line, a gesture, a future. But this is where the most important Viking advantage appears. The builder did not wait for a complete internal skeleton. In the Nordic clinker tradition, the hull was conceived and built shell first. That means the outer skin came before the full internal strengthening. The shape of the ship emerged through the planking itself. That shell-first logic is one of the reasons a Viking ship could seem to rise so quickly. Academic work on clinker shipbuilding argues that Viking Age ships were conceived and constructed simultaneously by eye using remembered rules of thumb and what the researchers call mental templates. No blueprint on parchment, no modern naval architecture drawing pinned to a wall. The master carried the form in his head, in his hands, in the habits of apprenticeship, and in a tradition transmitted over years. UNESCO's account of Nordic clinker boat traditions notes that in the past, it could take up to 10 years to learn the trade under a master. So when a ship took shape rapidly, that speed was built on a decade of training. The Longship was fast because the knowledge behind it had already been moving for generations. Here is the hook that changes everything. A Viking ship could look spontaneous only because it was the product of memory so disciplined it behaved like engineering. One plank was fitted against another in overlapping strakes, the classic clinker method. Each new plank had to be cut, twisted, and offered up to the hull with the right flare, twist, and run. But here again, the Vikings had a practical advantage that modern people often miss. Fresh, wet oak is softer and more obedient than dry, stored timber. In the reconstruction of Skoldilev III, the planks were split from strong oak logs and fitted into the hull while still fresh and wet. They were supple enough to be twisted into shape without boiling or steaming. That is a stunning detail. It means some of the dramatic visible shaping happened because the builders understood timing. They did not just know wood, they knew when wood would listen. As the strakes climbed, the hull gained both form and confidence. And because clinker planks overlap, each new board helped stiffen the one below it. This is why the shell could be built first and then strengthened with frames. UNESCO's description of clinker tradition still puts it plainly. The shell of the boat is strengthened with frames. In other words, the skin came alive first. If you were watching a build at the decisive stage, you would not see a slow accumulation of anonymous carpentry. You would see a recognizable vessel appear early and then sharpen rapidly into something seaworthy. That visual effect alone may help explain why later imaginations turned Viking shipbuilding into a tale of shocking speed. There is a reason that final assembly could feel almost theatrical. In shell-first construction, the identity of the vessel arrives early. After the keel, stems, and first rising strakes, the lines announce themselves. Bow and stern begin to speak. The hull's sheer catches light. Each additional plank does not just add material, it sharpens personality. The Viking method turns form into a public event. You can watch a future hull emerge in real time. And because the craft lived in apprenticeship rather than paperwork, several tasks could move in parallel. While one team split oak, another could shape frames from crooked timber. While the blacksmith worked on rivets, others prepared scarf joints, nails, tar, rope, and fittings. The apparent speed of the shipyard was therefore partly the speed of coordination. The vessel was not being made by one pair of hands moving step by step through a checklist. It was being called into existence by a community of specialists whose labor met at the shoreline like streams joining a river. But wood alone does not hold a fleet together. Iron does. Viking shipbuilders used iron rivets and roves, along with wooden nails in other parts of construction. That made the blacksmith as essential to shipbuilding as the axeman in the yard. Thousands of fastenings might be needed on a large warship. The museum's reconstruction of the Longships Sea Stallion from Glendalough required 8,000 iron rivets. Think about what that means. Before the ship ever touched water, somebody had to smelt, forge, shape, transport, and fit the metal. The same reconstruction tracked the resources needed for a full-scale longship. Multiple oak trees for keel and stems, many more for planks, hundreds of naturally curved oak pieces for frames, thousands of nails, hundreds of liters of tar, sailcloth, and enormous lengths of rope. A ship did not emerge from one craftsman, it emerged from a system. And now we come to the moment when the title starts to make sense. Could Vikings build ships in one day? Not from forest to finished vessel. Absolutely not. Even the Viking Ship Museum estimates that the hull work of a longship on the scale of the Sea Stallion would probably have taken about 7 months in the Viking Age. And that excludes the making of tar, rope, sail, and dyes. But if the timber had already been selected, cleaved, kept ready in the right state, the iron forged, the crew assembled, the master prepared, and the shoreyard organized, then a decisive day of assembly could transform scattered parts into a ship-shaped reality at shocking speed. To an outsider, that final surge would be all they saw. The hidden months would stay invisible. The Bayeux Tapestry, though made in the 1070s after the Norman conquest and not as a technical manual, gives one of the most vivid visual hints of this world. It shows ship scenes, fleet preparation, and even tools used by boat builders, axes, broadaxes, and spoon bits that correspond closely with archaeological finds. It is not a perfect naturalistic record, and the museum warns that its ships are symbolic as well as descriptive. But as a picture source, it captures an essential truth. Shipbuilding was a public, urgent, organized act tied to war, transport, and power. You can almost feel the noise of it: trees falling, planks being shaped, men carrying timbers, boats swelling from labor under political command. Here is the chilling line beneath the romance. When a ruler wanted ships fast, he was not asking for a craft project. He was activating a machine. That machine depended on more than carpentry. Once the hull was planked, the joints had to be sealed. Tarred wool was packed where it was needed as caulking, including between scarf joints and between overlapping planks. Modern reconstructions of Viking ships still use a tarred wool thread between the boards, and the museum notes that this kind of seal is similar to what was found on the original ship. Tar itself was another world of labor, produced from wood and vital for preservation and maintenance. Without it, a ship might be beautiful and doomed. With it, the hull could resist rot and the sea a little longer. So even sealing the boat was part chemistry, part craft, part forestry, part time. Then came the internal strengthening: frames, crossbeams, thwarts, mast support, and the careful balancing of flexibility and force. This is another place where the Viking ship reveals its genius. It was not built like a rigid box meant to resist the sea by refusing to move. It survived by yielding intelligently. The cleaved planks retained natural strength and flexibility. The hull could work in heavy water. On modern voyages with reconstructed ships, boat builders have observed flexing in rough weather and have had to monitor fastenings and fittings closely. That living motion is not a flaw. It is part of the design philosophy. The Longship was not a floating wall. It was a controlled animal. But a hull without a sail is only half awake. The sail was one of the greatest investments in the entire vessel. The Viking Ship Museum notes that weaving and adjusting a sail to a specific ship was a lot of work, and that the square sail had to be developed together with the size and type of hull. Too broad and the ship would not handle correctly. Too narrow and it became dangerous in another way. Too low, too high, too heavy, too poorly balanced. Any of these could ruin the usefulness of the vessel. This is where the fantasy of one day really collapses, because a fast launch myth tends to focus on the timber shell while forgetting the sail, the rigging, the mast, the yard, the rope, the loading pattern, the ballast, and the crew knowledge. A longship was not finished when it looked finished. It was finished when hull, sail, rudder, weight, and wind all agreed. And there is one more hidden workshop inside this story: the rope maker's yard, the weaver's loom, and the harbor itself. The Sea Stallion reconstruction used 2,000 meters of hemp rope and a 112 square meter sail. That tells you immediately that shipbuilding was never just building the boat. It was the coordination of many crafts under one purpose. Written sources for the Viking Age and later medieval laws preserve hints of this organization. The Viking Ship Museum notes that sagas such as Snorri's Saga of Olav Tryggvason contain important information about shipbuilding, what ships looked like, and how boat wharfs and boat building were organized. Other texts preserve rules about navigation, weapons, and the organization of fleets. So when we ask how Vikings built ships quickly, the answer is not simply they worked hard. It is their society knew how to mobilize specialized labor toward ship production with extraordinary focus. William the Conqueror's ship list, preserved in a later manuscript but likely reflecting agreements made around the 1066 invasion, offers a revealing comparison from the end of the Viking Age. It records vassals obligated to supply hundreds of vessels and points toward harbor towns as the logistical centers expected to provide ships. The museum uses that document to illuminate the broader organization of maritime power in the period. That matters because the speed of ship appearance is never just about woodworking, it is about political concentration. If a ruler can call on harbors, skilled men, prepared timber, and supporting crafts, ships can appear with a suddenness that seems impossible from the outside, not because the laws of time were broken, but because the work had been distributed across a whole society before the launch day arrived. Now the title can be answered honestly. The Vikings did not build their ships in just one day. They built them in forests, in smithies, on rope walks, at looms, in law codes, in harbor towns, in memory, in apprenticeship, and in the disciplined habits of a maritime civilization. Then, on one astonishing day, they assembled all of that hidden labor into a visible shape and pushed it toward the sea. That is why the launch must have felt almost supernatural. After weeks or months of hearing blows in the yard, after watching men bend over raw timber, after seeing only fragments, keel here, stems there, planks stacked nearby, suddenly the hull stood complete, tar dark, ribbed with light, smelling of oak and resin. Then came the slide, the shout, the rope straining, the greased track, the dangerous grace of gravity doing its work, the first kiss of water, the checks for leaks, the mast to follow, the yard, the rigging, the sail. A ship is born in pieces, but it enters history all at once. And maybe that is why the legend survived. Human beings remember revelation better than preparation. We remember the ship in the water, not the years of training. We remember the dragon head, not the 10 years it might take to learn how to fit planks by eye. We remember the fleet on the horizon, not the harbor towns, the blacksmiths, the tar burners, the weavers, and the woodmen who made its arrival possible. But the real Viking achievement is bigger than the myth. The myth says they were impossibly fast. The truth says they were impossibly prepared. So the next time you picture a Viking ship, do not imagine a miracle of speed alone. Imagine a master choosing a tree by the bend of its grain. Imagine wedges opening oak along invisible lines. Imagine fresh planks twisting obediently before they dry. Imagine a builder carrying the hull in memory. Imagine rivets ringing into place. Imagine tarred wool pressed into seams. Imagine a sail measured to the temperament of the hull. Imagine a ruler able to summon not just a boat, but an entire chain of labor leading from forest to fjord. That is how Vikings built ships in one day. They spent months, years, and generations making sure that when the day came, almost nothing looked impossible.